There is a moment when confrontation feels tempting, but wisdom feels quieter. Not every battle announces itself with noise. Some arrive through subtle pressure, through manipulation disguised as concern, through people who drain energy not by attack, but by proximity. Machiavelli understood something uncomfortable about power. Those who provoke often seek reaction. Those who manipulate depend on visibility, and those who thrive on conflict are weakened by silence more than resistance. This is not a story about fighting back. It is about stepping out of reach, about understanding how control dissolves when attention is withdrawn, and how influence fades when it is no longer fed. In The Prince, power is never loud. It is strategic, patient, and rarely confrontational. This is the psychology of defeating toxic people, not by opposing them, but by becoming unreachable to their games. The first sign is rarely dramatic. There is no explosion. Toxic people do not always arrive as enemies. Often, they arrive as familiarity, as a habit, as someone whose influence has blended so smoothly into daily life that questioning it feels unnatural. Machiavelli understood that power rarely reveals itself openly. It operates through routine, expectation, and subtle pressure. The same is true of toxic influence. At first, the mind resists the realization. It explains the behavior away. They didn't mean it. They're just stressed. It's temporary. This resistance is not weakness. It is conditioning. Human beings are taught to preserve connection, even at personal cost, to tolerate discomfort in the name of loyalty, to doubt their perception rather than risk separation. But slowly, patterns begin to emerge. The same conversations loop without resolution. The same boundaries are crossed, then minimized. The same emotional weight appears after every interaction. This is where recognition forms, not as accusation, but as clarity. The realization is not that the other person is evil. It is that the dynamic itself is unbalanced. Machiavelli warned that dependence is the gateway to control. And in this early stage, the dependence is emotional. The need to be understood, the hope of mutual respect, the expectation that fairness will eventually appear. Yet toxic dynamics do not improve through patience. They persist through tolerance. This chapter is not about judgment. It is about perception sharpening. Once the mind begins to notice how energy shifts, how confidence erodes, how peace disappears after contact, something irreversible happens. The illusion cracks. And when that crack appears, the relationship can no longer operate in the same way, because power, once seen clearly, loses its invisibility. Recognition is not action yet. It is exposure. And exposure is where influence begins to weaken. Toxic behavior does not survive in silence. It feeds on response. This is the detail most people miss. They assume manipulation comes from strength, confidence, or dominance. But Machiavelli understood the opposite. True control depends on dependence. Toxic individuals rely on reaction the way fire relies on oxygen. They provoke not to resolve, but to remain relevant. They create tension not to communicate, but to secure attention. Psychologically, this behavior is rooted in insecurity. Control becomes a substitute for stability. Influence replaces self-worth. Reaction confirms existence. This is why confrontation often fails. When challenged directly, the toxic person does not reflect. They escalate, they deflect, they twist the narrative. Because the confrontation gives them exactly what they seek: engagement. Machiavelli warned that those who cannot command loyalty seek obedience through disruption. They destabilize others to feel balanced. Reaction reinforces this dynamic. Explaining oneself, defending intentions, seeking understanding. All of it signals availability, and availability is leverage. Modern psychology mirrors this insight. Behavior that is consistently reinforced continues. Behavior that is ignored weakens. This is why toxic people test boundaries repeatedly. They are measuring response, not morality, not fair. The moment the reaction stops, confusion begins on their side. Silence removes feedback. Distance removes access. Calm removes leverage. Without reaction, manipulation collapses into visibility. It becomes obvious, uncomfortable, ineffective. This chapter is not about labeling others as villains. It is about understanding mechanics. Toxic people are not powerful because they are aggressive. They are powerful only as long as someone reacts. Machiavelli's lesson is clear here. Power is not taken, it is granted. And the most decisive shift begins when attention is no longer offered freely. When the reaction ends, control has nowhere to land. Power does not announce itself. It does not raise its voice. It does not explain. Machiavelli never described strength as loud resistance. He described it as positioning, as the ability to remain untouched while others exhaust themselves. This is the core mistake people make with toxic individuals. They believe power must be proven through confrontation, that silence equals weakness, that distance is avoidance. But power in its most effective form is subtraction. To confront is to step into the arena chosen by the manipulator. To argue is to accept their rules. To explain is to grant them authority over interpretation. Machiavelli warned that those who seek to control outcomes must first control exposure. Visibility creates vulnerability. Access creates leverage. Psychologically, confrontation activates emotional loops. The nervous system reacts. Defensiveness rises. Clarity narrows. Toxic individuals thrive here. Emotion blurs perception. Reaction accelerates mistakes. Non-confrontation, by contrast, creates asymmetry. Silence interrupts expectation. Calm disarms escalation. Distance denies reinforcement. This is not passivity. It is restraint with intention. Power without confrontation operates through predictability on one side and unpredictability on the other. The toxic person expects a reaction. They anticipate explanations. They prepare for defense. When none arrives, they lose orientation. Machiavelli understood that the strongest position is one where nothing is demanded and nothing is offered unnecessarily. Neutrality becomes authority. Modern psychology calls this emotional regulation, the ability to observe without absorbing, to remain composed without withdrawal. The absence of confrontation does not signal fear, it signals independence. This is where the dynamic shifts, not because anything is said, but because nothing needs to be. When confrontation is removed, control loses its stage, and without a stage, performance ends. This is power that does not fight. It simply remains intact. Choosing not to confront does not feel natural at first. The body resists it. The mind protests. There is an instinct to explain, to correct the narrative, to defend one's position before it hardens into misunderstanding. Machiavelli understood this tension well. He knew that the greatest battles are not fought outwardly, but internally, between impulse and restraint. Silence in the presence of toxicity can feel like loss. Loss of dignity, loss of voice, loss of control. The ego interprets quiet as surrender. It whispers that not responding means being diminished, that letting things stand is the same as agreeing with them. Psychologically, this conflict is rooted in fear of misperception. Human beings are wired to seek coherence, to be seen accurately, to belong within a stable narrative. Toxic individuals exploit this instinct. They provoke precisely where identity feels fragile. They distort, accuse, or imply, knowing the other person will rush to restore balance. This is where the inner struggle intensifies. Stay silent and discomfort grows. Respond and the trap closes. Machiavelli warned that those who react too quickly reveal their priorities. Emotion leaks information. Defense exposes vulnerability. Restraint, however, feels like holding one's breath. The nervous system tightens. Thoughts circle. The urge to speak returns, again and again. This phase is dangerous, not because silence is wrong, but because it is misunderstood by the self. Many abandon restraint here, not because confrontation is wise, but because discomfort becomes unbearable. Yet this discomfort is evidence of transition. The mind is learning to tolerate ambiguity, to exist without immediate resolution, to trust that not every distortion requires correction. This is the cost of non-confrontational power. It demands emotional discipline. The ability to let tension exist without discharging it outward. Machiavelli believed that control begins where reaction ends, but before the reaction ends, resistance must be endured. This chapter is not about peace. It is about endurance, because only those who survive this internal conflict reach the turning point, where silence stops feeling like weakness and begins to feel like choice. There comes a moment when something quietly shifts, not outside, but within. The toxic behavior does not stop. The provocations remain. The distortions continue, but the reaction changes. This turning point is subtle. It does not arrive with confidence or certainty. It arrives at a distance. The mind stops leaning forward. Stop anticipating the next move. Stop rehearsing explanations that will never satisfy. Machiavelli understood this moment as strategic withdrawal, not from the situation, but from emotional investment. When expectation dissolves, manipulation loses traction. Psychologically, this is detachment, not indifference, not coldness, but separation between stimulus and identity. The toxic person senses this shift before it is visible. Their tactics begin to fail quietly. What once triggered urgency now meets stillness, and stillness is disorienting. Without reaction, their behavior loses direction. There is no resistance to push against, no defense to exploit, no emotion to harvest. This is where power changes hands. The person practicing restraint begins to observe clearly. Patterns emerge. Repetition becomes obvious. Intent reveals itself without effort. Detachment sharpens perception. Instead of asking, "Why are they doing this?" the mind asks, "What does this behavior need from me?" And often, the answer is attention. Machiavelli warned that those who depend on others' reactions are never truly in control. The moment dependence disappears, leverage collapses. Emotionally, this turning point brings relief, not because the situation improves, but because it no longer defines the self. The nervous system settles. Energy returns inward. Focus narrows to what can actually be governed. This is not a retreat. It is repositioning. From here, engagement becomes optional. Response becomes deliberate. Silence becomes strategic, not forced. The toxic person has not been defeated publicly. They have been rendered ineffective privately. This is the turning point, where confrontation becomes unnecessary, because influence no longer flows outward. It returns to its original place, within. The mind no longer treats toxicity as an intrusion. It becomes information, neutral, observed, understood. This is where Machiavelli's insight becomes internal law. Power is not exercised through reaction, but through self-command. Psychologically, the nervous system recalibrates. What once triggered alertness now registers as familiar terrain. Emotional spikes soften into awareness. The body learns it does not need to brace itself every time. This is inner authority. Authority does not announce itself. It does not explain. It does not correct every falsehood or challenge every slight. It simply governs response. The individual no longer needs to prove boundaries. they embody them. And embodiment is harder to violate than words. Toxic people rely on instability, in the hope that someone will overextend, overexplain, or overreact. But when behavior is consistent, predictable, and restrained, manipulation finds no entry point. This integration also changes self-perception. Worth is no longer measured by how well one handles others. It is measured by how little one is pulled off center. There is compassion here, not indulgence, but clarity. An understanding that toxic behavior is often driven by fear, scarcity, or unresolved need. But understanding does not mean accommodation. Machiavelli never advised cruelty for its own sake. He advised realism. And realism teaches that not every person deserves access. Not every interaction deserves energy. Not every provocation deserves a response. As this lesson integrates, life grows quieter. Not empty, but efficient. Attention becomes selective. Engagement becomes intentional. Silence becomes a form of language. This is healing, not because others change, but because the self no longer negotiates its stability. At this stage, defeating toxic people is no longer the goal. They fade naturally from influence. What remains is alignment, a mind that governs itself first, and that, Machiavelli would say, is the most durable form of power. The final victory does not look like triumph. There is no moment of confrontation, no visible defeat, no apology offered or demanded. What remains is quieter than that. The toxic presence no longer holds weight. Their words pass through without lodging. Their behavior reveals itself without needing interpretation. They are seen clearly, and clarity removes fascination. This is the quiet victory Machiavelli understood well. Power that does not need to announce itself endures longer than power that demands recognition. At this stage, the mind no longer frames life as a struggle against others. There is no opponent to outmaneuver, no game to win. There is only one position. Psychologically, this is integration at its deepest level. The self is no longer organized around defense. It is organized around direction. Energy flows toward creation, not containment. Attention returns inward. Where influence actually begins. The toxic person does not change, but their relevance dissolves. And that dissolution is not forced. It is earned through consistency, through restraint, through the refusal to be emotionally available for manipulation. Silence becomes spacious rather than tense. Distance becomes clean rather than hostile. Presence becomes grounded rather than reactive. This is not isolation. It is discernment. Machiavelli never wrote about peace as comfort. He wrote about stability as strength. And stability is what remains when external forces no longer dictate internal movement. The person who reaches this point no longer seeks to defeat toxic people. They outgrow them. They move slower, speak less, observe more. Their power is not visible, but it is felt. In this way, interactions shorten. In this way, provocations lose momentum. In the way chaos fails to attach. This is the end of the struggle, not because the world softened, but because the mind hardened where it mattered. The victory is not over others. It is over dependency. And once that is won, no toxic presence can ever truly reach inside again.